Hello and welcome to Autosport's look back at day 2 of testing ahead of the 2023 F1 season. I'm Martyn Lee, joined in a moment by our own Matt Q, who is at the Bahrain International Circuit for us. We'll chat to Matt shortly, but let's take a look back at how they finished up on day 2. The times, for whatever they do mean, on day 2 of a test, led by Alfa Romeo's Zhou Guanyu, putting in 133 laps. Max Verstappen was at the top of the timesheets almost at the end of the day, in second place in his Red Bull, with a bit of reliability to talk about on the show today. Fernando Alonso up there as well, ahead for Aston Martin, and Nick de Vries in 4th. Nico Hülkenberg in his Haas in 5th, followed by Carlos Sainz's Ferrari and Logan Sargent once again putting in a load of laps, 154 laps in 7th place on the timesheets. The Ferrari of Charles Leclerc in 8th. Oscar Piastri in a McLaren that isn't looking entirely dialed in yet. We'll talk about that today. And Pierre Gasly in 10th in his Alpine. So let's go over to Matt Q, who is part of our team covering testing this week. Another interesting day on track, Matt. So Zhou Guanyu was fastest and then brought out a late red flag to stop any glory runs, if anybody was planning on those. How did Alfa Romeo end up on top?
Hi Martin. Yeah, I don't think it's time to bet too much money on Alfa Romeo winning the championship this year based on that headline time. But I think sort of it's worth praising initially Alfa Romeo. Just how they're conducting themselves. If you think back to this time last year, all those stoppages around the floor where it's scraping along the ground, sort of just shredding itself apart, and further unreliability. They run pretty much like clockwork. Almost had a seamless day, but we'll get to that shortly. So Joe, the headline time was he 400ths of a second quicker than Verstappen, but I'm afraid to burst that bubble. He was doing it on the fastest C5 tyre compared to Verstappen on a yellow wall medium, so not quite the halo time it's made out to be perhaps. And obviously you have all the usual testing caveats of unknown engine modes, unknown fuel modes, and all those different things, this qualifying simulations. But yeah, an impressive lap time from Zhou, which just for reference takes us now a couple of tenths beyond where we ended up on the final day of testing last season, which was obviously at the end of 6 days, so 3 in Barcelona, 3 in Bahrain, and Verstappen did that late low fuel glory run. So despite the changes to the fuel regulations and people being worried about cut downforce, we're actually quicker than we were last year, which is no mean feat. I suppose actually, sorry, this is a slight tangent, but goes to show the effectiveness of the cost cap, that all those late season developments that had to be shelved because of being up against a budget or because of crashes or whatever, they've now been applied, plus your development, and see the massive pace step forward that's been taken over the season with such a steep learning curve. But yeah, Zhou on the C5 tyres, and then just as he set his time, he came in for a quick visit to the pits, and Alfa sent him out again, but he stopped at the end of the pit lane with an issue that Alfa, as sort of 10 minutes ago speaking to Zhou, they're still looking at investigating, and the FIA sort of have a customary systems check, and so when Zhou stopped, although it was in the end of the pit lane and not out on track, they turned it into a full red flag just to make sure sort of everyone was paying attention, really. Yeah,
there was also a systems check of the 5 lights and away we go. But that didn't go too well today, with a lot of after you on the grid. But let's not go into the bit of a botched start that was or not happening today. Still not quite as weird as Hamilton, Hungary 2021, but still. So Max Verstappen was quick yesterday. He was quick today. That's the last we've seen of Max Verstappen now. Nobody wants to be top of the timesheets because they don't really mean anything in testing. But does it mean that all is well with the RB19?
On Max's side of the garage, it looks very ominous. So part of the privilege of doing this job is going to watch trackside, and I am not Adrian Newey, I'm not an ace engineer either, but you can certainly observe certain things, and the violence with which the RB19 changes direction is super impressive. However, it does look certainly more that case with one driver than it does the other. So Sergio Perez, he's got the short straw. He was running in a super hot morning session, so overnight the track gets a bit dusty, it's hot, it shreds the tyres, it's not very representative of the race at all, and naturally in extremely hot temperatures the cars are slower, so there is a pace differential to Verstappen more than normal. But if you wind back to the start of last year, the reason Perez was so effective is because he was sort of mastering a an overweight car that was understeering a bit too much, and then as it got lighter it favoured Verstappen, and it seems that we're still in that place. So in the morning session I was down at turn 10, which is that downhill off camber left-hander, and there were, in a half-hour period, a couple of stints from the medium and the hard tyres. There were sort of 6 or 7 like proper lock-ups, and then a couple of other laps where he's under rotating, the wheels going slow, and he's not only missing the apex, he's running completely off the asphalt and onto the exit tarmac and sort of rejoining halfway down the straight, and it just looked a bit unconvincing, slightly less happy. So although the lockups is the front end rushing wide, and that looks a bit perverse because we know Perez is good at that, that can be stimulated by the rear getting a bit nervous and Perez having to overcompensate. So it's looking like in that respect, okay, only a small sample size, but not an awful lot of change. So Verstappen's still the lead driver. I think we can safely say for now.
I think it's fair to say that. Yeah, Red Bull. Talk about Mercedes for a second, because they seem okay. They're talking about balance being the issue, and that's much easier to fix than coming away thinking, I think we got the floor wrong, boys and girls. So they can dial that out. It kind of looks mid-corner when the tyres are screaming that they need a little bit of help. But is the limited testing today with George Russell's hydraulic failure, I think he was stuck in gear or something, is that a big blow for Mercedes? Can they recover from that on the final day?
A little bit, because one, you're losing mileage when testing is so limited, and two, they have a diagnosable problem, balance, and the way you resolve that is by fine-tuning setup and sort of springs and damper settings or whatever. So any laps you're losing is data you're losing in the attempt to resolve that. I did find it slightly wryly amusing that Russell said, well, okay, we're not porpoising, but we had these balance issues, but at least we're reliable, and then causes a breakdown by the end of the day, which is slightly amusing. But they're fronting up to the problems. They know that it's a bit wayward, and it's you can see it really on the tarmac where they're leaving black lines because they're washing wide, and the tyres are sort of sliding and then biting again, and the drivers are sort of singing off the same hymn sheet in that respect. So it's a car problem rather than particularly with Russell or particularly with Hamilton. And again, if to bring in those trackside observations, it looks composed. It was we've still got this sort of discrepancy between porpoising and bouncing, and actually what we saw yesterday where people going, oh, porpoising's back, well, yes, it was, but that was deliberate because teams were sort of doing extremes of setup to go, right, it still exists, but we know it only does it if you do this and this. So if we just turn it down from a 10 to a 9, then we're okay, we're in the clear. So that's what we saw a lot of teams with, but Mercedes, independent of that, still have sort of that very stiff car, and that could be attributed to, or you could relate that to the car sort of washing wide at certain moments, a bit unforgiving. Still work to do. They say that considering how bad they were this time last year to get third, they're excited that they're not really in the mire, and so they think they can be in title contention by the end of the season. But they would say that, wouldn't they?
No, I guess so. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but chatting to all you guys that are trackside, I'm sort of hearing a couple of common themes. Firstly, the Aston Martin. We don't know what fuel load it's on, but we think reasonably heavy. People are, you guys saying, that looks all right, actually. It's just testing, but we'll get onto them in a minute, actually, and talk about their drivers. But the other thing, I've been talking about McLaren. How does it look on track? Now, I know, times are one thing, but when you've been doing the job a while, you can stand on track side and just look at the behaviour of a car and its poise, and people are saying, look, those McLarens look like a bit of a handful at the minute. What are your thoughts on McLaren coming out publicly and telling Autosport today that they haven't met their development targets, I think was the phrase, or expectations?
Yeah, I think you can read a lot into body language, and Zach Brown, okay, media sessions and press conferences might not be his favourite activity, but this was a more downbeat than usual Zach Brown, and I think you can read a lot into that, and just teams' body language. Everyone has a story to tell in the F1 paddock, and whether it's caterers or tyre washers or whatever, their sort of general enthusiasm or lack thereof tells a story. And at McLaren, it's not sort of a disaster, but it's sort of like, oh, here we go again. We've not closed the gap. We might be behind Alpine again. And I think the thing to sort of appreciate is that the McLaren from trackside looks bad. It's not going to be behind the Williams, we don't think, even though the Williams looks composed, but it's really exaggerated how long both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri are having to wait for the front to bite, and how many lockups there are, and how patient they are getting back onto the throttle. That in and of itself is really frustrating for them. But that's exactly the same problems that they had last year, which it took Norris so long to adapt to, and ultimately, has led to Daniel Ricciardo having his contract ripped up because he just couldn't get around that. And the fact that, okay, it's one thing not to improve pace, but Piastri is saying it handles exactly the same as the last car I drove. So, where they've got that obvious weakness, they haven't addressed it, and that's bad. And there's already this talk about, not just upgrades coming, but B-spec car coming, because it's a lot of wrongs to put right. And yes, body language not great.
Ouch. And, that's the genius of racing drivers, that Piastri did one session, I think, for McLaren a year ago, and a professional racing driver can make that comparison of cars. It's just incredible what they do. Logan Sargent in the Williams put in some serious mileage today. New boss James Vowles is there. He's got his team colours on, so to speak, the branded clothing. So how do you think Williams will be feeling at the end of today?
I think quite satisfied. 154 laps for Sargent, which was the sort of the most of any one driver. And again, the car looks compliant. No sort of massive theatrics through the corners. The big sort of thing you notice watching the Williams is it's stable. It gets on the power well, but there's the turn 5, 6, 7 kink, which is a gradual left, a sharp right and a left, and Verstappen's really attacking that. Alonso looks good through there, and the Williams are just having to back off so far, and maybe some of that you would attribute to sort of Sargent acclimatising or fuel loads or whatever, but it's that usual thing with Williams that we've seen over the past few years, which is good in a straight line and whatever, but just really a significant downforce deficiency. But having said that, the metric we were told from Alex Albon is go to turn 10. If we're locking up loads, we've still got a real same balance problem that we haven't solved, and I've been watching for a fair bit, and they haven't been locking up. So that suggests that although Williams isn't going to be fighting for the championship, if they have solved that problem, then in terms of at least development, maybe you could argue they've done a better job than McLaren. I don't think that'd be unfair to say, although it's so early at this stage.
So more and more chatter, I'll call it that, about the seriousness of Lance Stroll's wrist injury or injuries, but what's the official line? Because we know that Drogovic is back in the car tomorrow morning, Alonso, I think, in the afternoon. People are naturally going to say, well, who's racing next weekend? Are we being shared anymore? And if he is properly, has properly hurt himself, then, obviously we hope he makes a speedy recovery. But you've mentioned the violence, of the Red Bull, but all Formula One cars are violent. And if he's properly hurt himself, then he won't be racing next weekend. What do we know?
Yeah, no major new updates there in terms of Lance Stroll condition, but the latest is who has daily assessment, and it's been divulged by Mike Crack that it's a hand and or wrist injury, which even with power steering is no good over a Grand Prix distance. There's been plenty of speculation about the severity of that, and if I was a betting man, to tie it back to what I was saying at the show, I might be putting my £5 on Felipe Drugovich starting the race to finish last season competitively. Okay, they lost out to Alfa on countback in the 6th in the championship, but I think this car looks a considerable step on, and if they can continue that development curve, then that's really promising. I think you'd look at Aston as potentially being the biggest mover this season, really sort of ready to close the gap and sort of fight at the top end of the midfield, and everything we're seeing in the trackside sort of supports that. Okay, there's been a few moments of oversteer under power, but Alonso he's pulling wide and really chucking the car in, and it's lapping it up, it's sticking with it, it's not understeering, there's no major sort of mid-corner corrections, it's only that little bit of squat and nervousness under power. Otherwise, obviously he's wearing a helmet, but I reckon he's probably smiling under there.
Well, thank you, Matt, for on the podcast today. What do you think now? Leave us a comment below. On our last video at the Alpine launch, people in the comment section were more than preoccupied about your accent. Like, people were saying, where is Matt from? I can't work. Where are you from, Matt?
I'm from the lovely Midlands. I don't think we have an accent. We're Queen's English as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I mean, you've got a bit of an accent, but there was an unhealthy preoccupation in that last video about where is Matt from. Dear comment section, now you know. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video and you want to follow our testing coverage, or just talk about where Matt's from, that's all right. You can subscribe to our videos, leave a comment below. We do read all of the comments and get a steer from you about who you think is doing well in testing, and looking forward to this season. We'll be back in less than 24 hours to cast our eyes over the final day of pre-season testing in Bahrain. We'll see you on the next one.